All right, me. It is Saturday, the 13th, 14th, the 14th. And I've just finished reading Pillow Thoughts by Courtney Peppernell. Um, Boy, what to even say about this collection? This is poetry collection. I think this is the re-release. I think this got republished or had a reprint in like 2019. I think this is that version. But yeah. God, there's 250 pages within this collection of poetry, and really a lot of just like singular thoughts and singular ideas. And I think I marked 4 of them. So, let's say, 240, 1 out of every 60 pages. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that so many of the things that are here, are true to the title, right? They are very much pillow thoughts because they are so singular, and there's just like, there's not a lot to them, right? I think a lot of the concepts and a lot of the ideas are beginnings to poetry, or like, hey, look, here's something to start with and then go off of and build on top of. But they're not things worth publishing within themselves, which is just, it's a really interesting thing to me of like, it's an entire book of that. And I'm just, and not like, just like a little book of them. Like it is I think this was from like Target, right? So it's like heavily published and placed into major markets. And, that's just one of those wild things to me. But yeah, I think the other thing about this book is it is very easy to look at and really understand why poetry is so hard to sell, because especially in our contemporary form of poetry, starting from the 1970s, 1980s, which is the very emotional, impactful, very personal stories that can get involved with poetry. It's very hard to sell that because you have to write that in a way that is, if you're going to sell poetry, right, you can't write it for yourself, right? My own, pieces that I have, which are, I think 80, right? I'm never going to publish them in a way that like is ever going to make me money, right? Because they're so deeply me and personal to me that unless you're me, they're never gonna work the same way. So then within poetry, what do you have to do then? You have to describe things in a way that is a little bit more universally understood if you want to sell poetry, which then leads to something like Pillow Thoughts, in which, everything is just so vague and so just like, this can apply to everybody type literature and thoughts and ideas. And it's just not enjoyable in that, for that, right? And part of that's because, I'm not necessarily, number one, I'm not necessarily the person that this book is written for, right? But also it's as much as I don't want to say it, right? I'm not necessarily the average reader in terms of things, right? It is part of my job and is part of, what I was taught to do and how I've always looked at literature. But then also, what I now do as a profession is constantly looking at the overarching things and like being able to pick and pull and view a lot of things in a lot of different ways, right? And there's just what feels to me an intense shallowness, because what it feels like so much is that there are stories, concepts, ideas that are within here that to then sell to a larger market, we then boil the hell down, right? And we get rid of so much of this personal detail and this personal experience to make it more universally accepted and understood, which is just like such a shame, I think, because there are a few poems in here that still keep what I would consider the very personal stories, right? The stories that we don't necessarily, can't immediately connect to, right? But that all comes in at the very last section, which is the these poems are for you section. But like that's where all like the actual personality lies, I think, within the poetry, which is a shame. It really is, right? But that's also where we get to see like, oh yeah, right? Yes, we're writing poetry about a very specific story, about a very specific moment in our lives. But if we just take a second to think about the poem, we can then go, oh yeah, that applies, and we see the thematic ideals within them, right? But for so much of the rest of the book, right, it's nothing. It's just a big nothing burger, and that's so upsetting, right? But yeah. The things I bookmarked, right? One of them is, right. We have a start of like a really, really nice metaphor and like use of a poem, which is it's about loneliness, and it's describing themselves as a sailboat, and the loneliness of the water, but as long as you're in the water, you're not lonely, right? Which is a very nice, solid, like conceptual idea. But the thing is 2 sentences long. It's 2 lines long, and that's it. And like there's nothing more to it. We don't get there's no exploration of what that is, right? And it's like that's such a shame, right? The other ones that I bookmarked, I think 2 of them are at least the same in terms of the same interesting thing. That's the sailboat. Yep, that's the same one. And I just bookmarked all 3 of them. Oh, we'll talk about this one first. Right, there's another one in which, right, it's toward the end of this, in which it is discussing about how a lot of the events in the world and what we think about and what makes us change isn't always what we think of, right? Because we think of milestones and huge milestones as the important things, right? We think of the birthdays and graduations and anything like that as like milestones of which we've changed. But then sometimes it's not that, right? Sometimes it is just waking up one day and realizing that things are different, right? Which is such, once again, a very nice conceptual idea, not just for a singular poem, but for like a whole series of poems. And yet, despite that being the poem's thoughts, the vast majority of the collection then doesn't capitalize on that, right? And it feels just so scared to discuss all these minuscule things that have changed us or changed Peppernell, and actively citing them and looking at them and making them interesting, right? And yet it almost never does that. And it's just such a wild thing to me of like, you have this poem in here that is very specifically about, we need to celebrate the small things in which we realize that we've changed, and then we just don't do it, right? And then the very interesting thing that I want to talk about is there's a metaphor that gets used in here a couple times, which is always something that's been very, very, very interesting to me. A couple books ago, I don't remember exactly what I was talking about it for, but I was talking about, you know, cannibalism as metaphor for love, and, you know, how that was very, you know, basic metaphor. Because I think inherently it is, right? I think it was a little too derogatory towards it when I was talking about it, but like, you know, within this collection, I think the most interesting thing that occurs, because also I think the most unique expression of love and desire and yearning is Peppernell's decently consistent use of like wanting to be around someone so much, or love someone so much that you want to either be inside their skin or stitch yourselves to them, right? And I think I think that's probably the most interesting metaphor in all of this, and right, because it's so, it takes this idea of like the cannibalism as a metaphor for love, and like wanting someone so badly that you want to survive through them, right? But then not necessarily through their survival instinct, but rather you are so desperate for them that you want to be them, right? Which is such an interesting concept, that like, it feels both very young but also feels intensely old. And it gets used, I think, 3 or 4 times throughout the book. I bookmarked 2 of them, but I think it gets used like 3 or 4 times. So like, that's by far the most interesting metaphor that gets used. And it's also, I would argue, the only metaphor that doesn't get explained, right? And this is, I think, the harshest part about this collection, right? Because having a poetry book that's a little bit of poetry, self-help, isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? That's fine, right? That's totally, it's accessible. That's very nice. And the problem is that every once in a while, Peppernell actually does like start and like use some pretty decent metaphors and like ideas and concepts, and then just fully explains the metaphor within the poem, right? The 2 that I can think off the top of my head are the bricklayer and the sweaters, right? Because it's like, the sweaters, they get used a couple different times as like, you know, symbolic of the stitching and the wearing of someone else's skin and things like that. But then there's a poem that's in the middle-ish, which just then fully explains the metaphor of the sweaters, and it's like, why? This is like the second thing in this entire book that's actually made people think a little bit, and it's, yeah, that one was rough. And then the bricklayer one, because there's a couple different poems that talk about, you know, building up walls, or, you know, wanting to separate and isolate yourself because of heartbreak or from loneliness or things like that. And then we get to the bricklayer poem, which is just like, it's a very nice concept, right? Of like, here's this person I really want to love, and they are building up this brick wall, but they say that they're doing it for me because they think that that's what I wanted, right? Because, you know, I said, you know, hey, I want to be, you know, alone. I want to learn about myself a little bit first, right? But then the ending just like, it fully explains the metaphor of like, oh yeah, this brick wall's too tall even for love. And it's like, why do that? Why add in those 2 lines? You don't need to add in those 2 lines. You're allowed to have your audience and readers think every once in a while, right? But yeah. you know. So in a lot of ways, it was a very frustrating poetry collection, simply because it was like there's so many things in it that are like, hey, that's a really solid, nice start to it, and then we just abandon it. So yeah, you know, I think overall, Pillow Thoughts, I think taking this, you know, I've just finished my first semester of teaching. You can expand this as an even larger metaphor for, you know, the state of thinking about literature, and right, not even like media literacy, but like our willingness to actually think about literature, and new literature is so fundamentally broken, right? And I think part of that's just because I was teaching classes that were not academically the best, right? These were students that were in school because of the CTE classes, right? Of the masonry, brick, automotive, things like that, and they just happened to also have to take English in order to graduate. So I think that was certainly a large part of it, but like, just their ability to read things, and like just not ever wanting to think one step past what is there, right? The need and desire to, they just need to have everything told to them immediately without ever having to think is really a shame, right? Even like, oh god, we did, for my English threes, we looked at, I had some of my kids look at Cross by Langston Hughes, which is like such a basic poem, and I had like 6 kids look at that poem for a project, and I think only 2 of them understood immediately, and it took another one like 2 or 3 reads, and then the other 3 just never got it, right? I was like, and these aren't dumb kids, right? These are, you know, decently smart kids, but like, it's just such a struggle and a shame of like, yeah, this is really the state of where we're at, because we don't want to think, or we don't want to even just like, we don't even want our audience to think, right? And that's such a shame. That really is such a shame. But yeah, anyways, that's Pillow Thoughts by Courtney Peppernell. You know, I was definitely very negative on it. I think it's a very nice introductory type of poetry book. But yeah, that's that.